Welcome to part 2 of animal ethics as part of the bioethics course at the University of Sydney. For those of you who haven't been able to watch part 1, I do recommend watching it before watching this one. There's some background ethical frameworks and positions that you'll need to know in order to follow this one. But if you do want to watch this as a standalone lecture, that is okay. I'll just give you a little bit of background again. My name is Gemma. I'm a postgraduate at Sydney Uni, and I work with Dominic in philosophy of psychiatry. I also do history of psychiatry. But my background is in environmental science, human geography, and I've also been an activist for animal ethics and animal rights for a long time. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, and we can keep working through the slides. Okay, so in the first lecture, these are the important points that I can conclude. It's a recap of that material. The first point was about how we understand what it means to be worthy of moral consideration. And beings are worthy of moral consideration when they have a moral claim that the being has on those who are subject to such a claim, right? So you can be worthy of moral consideration, but if the other creature or person or being or anything, the other object, the other thing that is meant to be conferring that moral consideration on you isn't able to, then that doesn't count. So if you are talking about humans to humans, generally speaking, although not in all circumstances, but generally speaking, humans have a moral consideration for each other, and they're able to confer it on each other. But when you have an unevenness there, it only goes in the direction that it's possible to go. So for instance, my cat is worthy of moral consideration by me, but I'm not quite sold on me being worthy of moral consideration to my cat. And, you know, that's how they act, basically. So that's how we understand moral consideration. Second point, it's often thought that humans are the only beings which can have such claims. So the cat example wouldn't work there. But justifying that difference between humans and non-humans is difficult, and it's ultimately problematic, and we should think about blurring that line. And we had a few different ways of thinking about that. And in that view, non-human animals are worthy of moral consideration, but how we understand that depends on our ethical framework and our knowledge of the relevant capacities of non-human animals. There are a few implications for that view, and they directly affect scientific research and place limits on that, and that's what we'll be discussing today. So let's move into it. This is the kind of diagram, the kind of story that you might be very used to hearing about the use of animals in scientific research. It's very familiar, and it comes with this kind of very optimistic view about the role of non-human animals in scientific research and their importance. So this is from the Department of Health in the UK, and they state that research on animals has contributed to almost every medical advance. And without non-human animal research, medicine as we know it today would not exist. It's enabled us to find treatments for cancer. It's enabled us to find treatments for infections through the development of antibiotics and vaccines for viruses, surgery for illnesses, injuries, and deformities. Okay, so there's a lot that non-human animal research has given to medicine and to the progression of humankind in total. And we can see that in very real outcomes. We know that life expectancy across most Western countries has increased on average by 3 months for every year of the past century. And many diseases have been wiped out almost entirely. Partly that was because of things like vaccines, although there is some disagreement about whether it's entirely because of that. It's a combination of public health and sanitation and these vaccines. But it goes, it's a matter of fact that there's a wider range of life-saving and important medication and treatments as a result of the use of non-human animals in research. And this means that many people benefit from the use of non-human animals in research, because many people require these kinds of treatments and these kinds of medications and so on. There's something like 50 million prescriptions written annually for antibiotics, and that's in the UK alone. All right. So you get these kinds of images where they say, how are animals used? Well, they're used in the discovery phase and the development phase of medical treatments. They do point to the existence of some alternatives to the use of non-human animals in research, but they focus on their limitations, and they focus on the fact that these are not well developed at this point. These are all sort of factual things, but this is meant to convince you that using non-human animals in research from now on is very central and necessary for the development of medical science. Okay, so where do I go from here? Okay, I want to question those kinds of statements, or those kinds of implied moral positions, which says that, you know, because in the past the use of non-human animals has been so central to medicine, and I don't deny that therefore we should continue doing it. I want to question that. So there's two ways of going about this. So say I'm setting out and I'm like, no, I don't feel right about, my intuition is that there's something wrong about using non-human animals in medical science. Okay, one option is I take the low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is that I take the easy stuff, the things that are very easy to argue against. And this, I hope you agree, is in fact very easy to argue against. So the use of animal testing in cosmetics. Now, you may not be aware, but this is something that's being phased out. This is true across the world. And if you were asking me in the 1990s, for instance, about what kinds of products have been tested on animals, what kinds of cosmetic and personal use products have been tested on animals, it was a vast majority, right? It was very common practice to use non-human animals in the testing of optional cosmetics. I'm not talking about prescription ones, I'm talking about optional. So the kinds of tests that are used in cosmetics is toxicity tests and irritancy tests and so on. Animal toxicity tests are actually quite an outdated and inefficient way of testing the safety of products, and they are really irrational or unethical. And I mean that in a lot of different ways, like it doesn't matter which kind of framework you're using, because they inflict a large amount of cruelty and suffering on the non-human animals in order to produce kind of crappy results, not very consistent, not as good as alternative methods. So when we think about this particular case, and I've got a couple of images here. The image of the rabbits is an LD50 test, or I think it is an LD50 test, yeah, where they're trying to produce a certain amount of toxicity to kill 50% of the test group. So the rabbits are constrained in that way, and then they'd have toxic chemicals put inside them, usually in their eyes and so on. The middle image is an artist called Jacqueline Trades. She did quite a profoundly moving piece of activism She sat outside a Lush, you know, the body product company Lush, who does not engage in animal testing. She was outside one of those shops, their shops in the UK, and she allowed herself to be subjected to the same kinds of things that non-human animals are subjected to in these tests. It was quite graphic and quite difficult to watch, but the point was we shouldn't be doing it. And the third image is a movie called Maximum Tolerated Dose. You can find that on the internet. It's very difficult to watch. That's a fair warning, but it makes a very clear case that when you have these examples of when using non-human animals in scientific research is both inefficient, ineffective, and inflicts a large amount of suffering and cruelty, you really should not be doing it. And part of this is because why would we say it was ethical to do something which is so unnecessary? It's unnecessary. Now, one of the reasons why it has continued is because certain countries, in fact, one very big country, has required the use of animal testing in all products that enter the country or are produced in the country, and that's China. Now, the Chinese market is a huge market, and most brands do not want to cut China out of their purview, right? So you think of any of the big name brands like Garnier, L'Oreal, Schwarzkopf, all those brands, they all test on animals. And the reason that they do is because they want to enter the Chinese market. Now, Australia had a change in law in regards to cosmetic testing, and recently banned the testing of cosmetics in Australia, but we still allow imports in. And also, China announced last year, and this is fantastic news, and it is an indication of the ethical argument here winning out the day, combined with a scientific argument, because it really is a combination of the ineffectiveness and the unreliability of these tests, combined with a moral position that it's not okay, that has led to this, because as well as consumer demand, because many people have read about what happens and then decided that they're not okay with it either. So last year, China announced that it was going to phase out animal testing. This is happening for cosmetics. This is happening slowly, but it is happening. It's excellent news. This piece that I've screenshotted here is actually from Vogue, the beauty magazine, which tells you how central in this kind of world these arguments are. Okay. But is that the best way to go about this kind of argument? Should I just stay with these very easy cases and convince you, I hope, that they're very wrong? Because it's easy. And it's hard for you to argue against me when I'm talking about something like cosmetics, which is not a necessary product, and the alternatives really are out there. Well, critics of animal experimentation tend to stress these cases where the benefits of a particular experimentation are small and the stress and the pain inflicted on animals is high. And those ones are clear. And I think in order to make a more nuanced argument, that's really not the place that we have to look at. Of course, in terms of activism, that's a bit different. If you're interested in things that you could actually make change on, focus on those ones. But we want a robust critique of experimentation. We have to look at grey cases. It is disturbing that many animal welfare guidelines allow for animals, non-human animals, to experience painful, lingering, or distressful death. More stringent regulation and restriction is definitely needed, but how can we work out what that should be if we're just looking at these severe cases? So what do we need to look at? We need to look at cases where the benefits are clear and foreseeable and the interests of animals are given serious consideration. That's not the low-hanging fruit. That's the most difficult. for someone who doesn't think that non-human animals should be used in experimentation, who's a critic of that, sorry, they need to look at these kinds of cases. So this is just an article if you're interested about what Australia's animal testing laws are, and it's here to remind me to tell you that yes, we do have regulation and law around using non-human animals in scientific research, but it's not good enough. It's very base level. There are certain kinds of animals that are not even considered, and it does vary right across Australia, and as I said, it varies globally. Like in the US, birds, poultry, fish, insects, those aren't even covered by any ethical frameworks or any regulation at all. They're not counted. And so we end up with these situations in which, yes, there are considerations, of course, and research that's done in this area needs to go through ethics boards, but the bar is fairly low. And what we need to do is raise the bar, and I'm going to argue why we need to raise the bar. Okay, so let's take a very difficult one, the one that I said that I was going to get to today. Chimeras for xenotransplantation. Okay, so this case is where we implant the implanting of a live animal organ or tissue or cell into a human patient. So we breed animals that can grow parts that are for us. And I don't just mean in the sense of the way that we use pigs' heart valves in bypass surgery, because that's not xenotransplantation. It's not chimerous xenotransplantation anyway. We're talking about using non-human animals in combination with human cells to specifically grow parts to use for human recipients. So the focus of this research has actually been on pigs. Now, why pigs? Pigs, they're actually about the same size as us in terms of organs, and we don't reject pig tissue as easily as we do some other animals. And generally, we would think that there would be some kind of blowback against using primates. So pigs seems to be the best option. And this includes the creation of transgenic animals, as I said, these pigs that have been genetically modified to add human genes involved in regulating immune responses. Because when we get a transplantation, our immune system fights the foreign object. So we don't want that to happen. So if we can genetically modify pigs to be such that if we do that process, then we're less likely to reject those organs, then we have a better situation medically. Now, there's a lot of positive kind of attitude towards this kind of work, because it's touted as potentially providing a solution to the shortage of organs for humans in need of transplants. And I know you've already covered the organ donation and organ markets earlier in this course. So you know that there's a lot of stuff going on with organ markets that involves a lot of disadvantage and poverty and differences between people in different socioeconomic groups, and it's very difficult to work out who should get organs and who shouldn't get organs and all that sort of stuff. This is a kind of way of getting around all of those arguments, that you don't have to enter into it all because you can grow organs on demand, right? And it includes people with type 1 diabetes, which are normally discounted from organ transplant for various reasons because of the immune system. Now, human trials are currently banned in Australia. That may change, but at the moment you can't do trials of implanting organs that have come from a pig into a human. So what are we doing? We're trying it on primates. So we're using pigs and primates. Some of that happens down in Melbourne at Monash. So There's some articles there. If you're interested, they're very positive. They're very pro this stuff, and they kind of go through what this kind of process will be and how it confers benefit on human populations. Okay, so here's a couple of pigs. They're from Melbourne Pig Safe. I'm just going to give you a bit of pause for thought about this kind of work. You may not be swayed by it, but you might be. I definitely am. But if this is meant to just make you go to pause, just to avoid this like overly optimistic, overly positive approach towards using non-human animals without kind of any moral consideration in order to benefit humans, right? Pigs are incredibly intelligent. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about pigs because I think most people don't understand how intelligent and how social pigs are. They're playful. They're very playful with each other and with other species, including humans. They're very protective and they bond with each other. So they make nests, they relax in the sun, and they cool off in the mud. Actually, you know how pigs like to roll in mud. The mud is, the reason for that is actually that mud is a sunscreen, ends up being a sunscreen for them so that they can avoid being burnt by the sun. It's a nice way of getting around that issue. Pigs are known to dream. They recognize their own names. They can learn tricks, like sitting down for a treat. They can learn as many tricks as dogs can, if not more. They lead very social lives of a complexity previously only observed in primates. So they're as complex socially as primates. Many pigs sleep in pig piles like dogs. They all cuddle up together. Some love to cuddle, some prefer space. They're very individual and they have strong personalities. They communicate with one another. They have observable preferences. And mother pigs sing to their young, songs that they write for their young in particular. And also, in fact, pigs are, if you want to do research on non-human animal intelligence, pigs are an excellent option, especially because they can pick up very complex tasks. They've been able to teach pigs to play simple video games, and they're much easier to work with than primates. They are much more kind of affable, and they're beautiful things. So if you want to know more about pigs, there's an article there. So that's just a pause for thought. So here's some questions that perhaps that might raise for you. And I'm going to leave them as questions. So first question is, are there any moral issues that chimeras raise in regards to species membership? And this is something I was talking about in the previous lecture, right at the end. So the fact that we're developing non-human animals to have human DNA, is there something that is important about that? Does that change the attitude we should have towards pigs in any significant way, or is it irrelevant? And if it's irrelevant, well then, you know, we must agree that the line between species is something to be blurred, and that's fine. But then we have to ask, you know, what are the morally relevant characteristics then? And pigs, you know, meet a lot of them. So, you know, that might be something you want to think about. The second question is it acceptable to use animals, non-human animals, as a source of live organs and tissue for transplantation into human beings? Now, I'm going to leave that as an open question because my personal opinion is no. But you have to think about, you know, why are you conferring different moral consideration on different species, and whether you think it's okay for some species or something like that. Pigs can definitely experience pain and happiness. They have preferences. They have all these kinds of things that we generally care about. Is it acceptable to create transgenic animals or chimeras as sources for xenotransplants? It's kind of the main question here. Is it acceptable to use xenotransplants in human beings? Now, I understand there might be some religious objections to using pig parts. We'll set those aside. But if you're talking about, using humans in these experiments, because at some point, if this technology is to be developed, we will have a situation in which there needs to be some experimentation that uses humans, right? So we have to wonder if that's okay. And in fact, that's actually the main part of the argument that has happened in the media, which for me isn't the interesting bit, but some people think that that part is not ethically okay. And that's the last question. Is it acceptable to conduct clinical trials involving xenotransplants for non-human animals or for humans? Is it okay to use primates for this kind of research, or humans? And is there any difference between those things? Like, why do we think it's okay to do that with primates but not humans? Seems to be a very gray area to me. Okay. So my position on that is this kind of work is not necessary. And the reason that I say this is because we can actually grow organs out of animals. We can grow it in labs. It doesn't actually have to be inside animals. So for me, I think that the work that's being done on growing them quite separate to animals, to non-human animals, is more promising and is what we should be focusing on. Okay. So what about other types of scientific inquiry? Could you make a case that despite the problems that we might have with using non-human animals in research, the role of non-human animals in medical research is just too important to change? Now, that's a very common argument. So what I mean by this is, could we argue that the benefits of animal models outweigh the costs? And theoretically, the answer is yes, especially if you're a utilitarian. When we understand the problem through a utilitarian framework, there may be some experimentation which is morally or ethically permissible, in the same way that there are certain kinds of experimentation which is morally permissible to be done on humans, right? Because we think that there are certain things that you can do to human populations, but they have limits on it, and there's lots of constraints and ethical constraints. But it's not like humans are off limits. You can't touch them. You can't do anything. It may be the case that there is some that is ethically permissible to non-human animals, rather, and that makes sense, right? At least theoretically, that makes sense. So the question then becomes: is there ethically permissible experimentation on non-human animals? Well, does it mean that everything we do now is ethically permissible? Absolutely not. That is not what you would argue. For instance, I just argued against using animal testing in cosmetics, and I think that's that's a very easy case where you can say no, that kind of experimentation is not permissible. And there are many gray areas, other gray areas too. The question, and this then comes down to this question of whether animal models actually do provide the best, as in the most efficient, the most reliable, the most ethically okay models. And the answer to that isn't as easy as those kinds of advertisements for the use of non-human animals in research seems to portray. That there are limits, and we just have to work out where those limits are. So, before we accept that common story of animal use in medical experiments, we need to assess the validity of the claims. So, the claims for using non-human animals in research. 1, they're cheap. They can't say no. It sometimes leads to new discoveries. Not always, in fact, not most of the time, but it sometimes does, and that's important. The animal models, non-human animal models, are easy to manipulate. And this is a kind of not an ethical argument, but it's just a practical one. They're currently required for and integral to most medical research. Okay, that's your arguments for. The arguments against are more interesting. It says animals don't get human diseases. So we have to actually be creating human diseases in animals, and that's not always perfect. Stressed animals yield poor data, and any animal in a lab is stressed. It's ethically problematic, and the only perfect model for a human body is the human body, and alternatives are increasingly available. Perhaps at the very least, proponents for and against animal testing can agree on one thing, that the use of animals in medical experiments is contingent on their usefulness. Animal models must work. So this leads directly to the question, do they work? This is called the argument for a necessity. So it's recognized that the harm done to animals is something intrinsically bad. Okay, we all agree that if we could avoid it, we wouldn't do it, right? But sacrificing non-human animal interests is necessary for the achievement of other greater aims. So utilitarianism and most forms of Kantian approach to non-human animals will allow for this, but utilitarianism allows for caring about the weighting of animal interests more directly. So we have to, this calls for this weighting of animal interests against the likely benefits. So Kantianism kind of allows this, especially the Kosgard kind of stuff, but for utilitarians, this is easier. This is called a decision cube that you can see here. And according to the model, we have to make judgments on 3 parameters of variation: the effect of the proposed experiment on the well-being of the animal, its potential contribution to scientific knowledge, and its expected utility. And when a research experiment falls in an opaque area of the cube, it shouldn't be done. So we have to weigh up all those 3 things against one another. And there's different sort of like acceptable is only the white squares, and animal suffer. The black squares are absolutely not, and the gray squares are probably not. Okay. So this all relies on us buying into something, and that something is that animal experimentation works. Okay, so that it actually gives us the results that we want. Now this is a quote. It's from a media article, so it is a spoken quote, so that's why it's very casual. I'll read it to you because I think it's interesting. It's from a former NIH director. It says, "We have moved away from studying human disease in humans," he lamented. "We all drank the Kool-Aid on that one, me included. With the ability to knock in or knock out a gene in a mouse, which can't sue us," Serene quipped, "researchers have over-relied on animal data." Here's the crux of it. The problem is that it hasn't worked, and it's time we stop dancing around the problem. We need to refocus and adapt new methodologies for use in humans to understand disease biology in humans. Okay, so evidence-based medicine is a term that's used throughout medical practice. Basically, we rely on evidence in medicine and medical research to support every practice that we do in that research, except for one, and this is the one. Despite the fact that millions of animals are used in experiments each year, as I said, 21 million in Australia, we rarely have scrutinized the data on animal experiments to determine how relevant they are for human disease and improving our lives. So we really haven't taken the time to look at the data and ask the same kinds of difficult questions that we ask of other kinds of research practices in medicine. And that is not evidence-based medicine then. So fortunately, that is changing. Since the mid-2000s, I would say, more scientists have begun taking a really hard look at that question. And what the evidence is showing is that we can't actually get much better answers about human health and diseases through animal experiments than we could human-based tests. In fact, the human-based tests are way, way, way better than the animal experiments, and the animal experiments tend to be quite unreliable. So as a result of this lack of focus on it, there's actually very little peer-reviewed work on and critical studies on the issues. And this was reflected in a report from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. In fact, the most recent reports from them have stressed that in order for us to ethically engage in medical research, and especially to engage in evidence-based research, we need to devote more time and more considerable effort on actually working out whether these models work. Someone who has been focusing on this quite directly is Akhtar, and I gave you one of her readings, a chapter from her as a reading this week. You can find some YouTube clips of her giving presentations about this work, and I do suggest you do, actually, because she's excellent. It says, and this is a long quote, but I'm going to read it. Over the last few decades, evidence-based medicine has become the mantra of sound, scientifically based medical research and practice. We rely on evidence-based medicine in virtually every facet of health research and practice, save one, the use of animal experimentation to inform human health. Animal experimentation has not been subjected to the kind of scrutiny that it requires. It is most often viewed as the default and the gold standard method of testing, yet it doesn't, with few exceptions, receive the critical examination needed to determine its relevance to human health. Right. So this is not a straight up call to stop animal experimentation. So we keep this in mind. It is an argument based on, if you are going to make the argument for necessity and you are going to claim that medical research engages in evidence-based medicine, then you need to apply the same rigor, academic rigor, and critical eye to non-human animal-based research as any other type of research. And that just hasn't been the case. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In fact, I'll say before I move on to the examples, if you do look for those kinds of pieces of work, if you're looking for systematic reviews and so on animal-based research, the ones that are out there do show quite dramatically that apart from a very small number of exceptions, and it's very small, most non-human animal-based research hasn't just been ineffective, it's been distracting. It sends people in the wrong direction, right? So in fact, all it's done is hampered the progress of research rather than actually progress it. As I said, there are one or two exceptions to that, a handful of exceptions to that, where non-human animal-based research has eventually led to developments which are huge. And those are the ones that, we focus on when we talk about using non-human animals in research. But for the vast majority of this work, it doesn't do that. And in fact, as I said, it makes us take longer. So let's look at a couple of examples. The first example I have is about diabetes. So we used mouse models for studying diabetes for a very long time. We've been using mouse models. Now, in 2009, we discovered that there was a significant flaw in the mouse model as a model of diabetes. So we make mice have diabetes and we do studies. Okay, so there's a crucial protein, CHC22, that controls blood sugar in humans, We weren't aware of this until 2009. But it's missing in mice, and we weren't putting it into the mice. And so we did a whole lot of research on diabetes, and some of it was mildly useful, sure. Some of it was quite useful, but none of it was quite on target because mice are not humans. They don't have this protein. And that protein is very crucial for diabetes, for understanding diabetes. So we perhaps were hampered by that. You can look into that if you're interested. There are lots of other cases like this. I'm going to talk about a couple more in a moment. But let's talk about why non-human animals actually aren't good models. Well, there's a number of reasons. The first is that lab environments actually limit the nature of what can be tested. A full expression of a biological creature can't actually happen in a laboratory environment. And if you think about, there's a very popular piece of research, which, I have some reservations about the research, but it was very important, perhaps not as important as some people claim, but very, very important in understanding the history of addiction. There's a piece of work that focused on taking rat models out of sort of singular, boring cages and putting them in a social environment, and that rats were less likely to engage in addictive behaviors when they're in a social environment. And that is a really important point to make about research. It's an important point to make about addiction, but it's a more important point to make about the use of non-human animals in research. That most of the time you're crafting these very artificial environments that don't actually reflect what we would find in normal populations of the non-human animal, let alone humans. Laboratory settings can and likely do influence results, right? So as I said, animals in labs, non-human animals in labs are always stressed. Laboratories are stressful environments. There's no way to get around that. They're not in a natural environment. We can't tell animals to ignore one factor or another or control their reactions to procedures and situations. So we're a little bit restricted, or a lot restricted, in what we can do and what we can understand. Animals in laboratories have little to no control over their environments. So this means that they are pushed towards certain kinds of behaviors or reactions that perhaps they would be able to avoid in other circumstances. Non-human animals are limited models for humans for exactly the reasons we justify their use. And what I mean by that is that we say, look, we can look at non-human animals because they're like humans like this, but they're actually not like us for so many reasons. And human models are just better, right? If we want to understand a disease, or the way a disease or a disorder works in a human, we must look at a human. So methodology can change, but the limitations of the models remain. Disease needs to be understood in context, and that context is the context of the human body and also the context of the human body in a social context. So that is more important for some disorders than others, but certainly if you're talking about mental disorders, you need to understand things in context. Otherwise, you're not actually getting a full and useful understanding of what disease and disorder does. So there are strong limitations on animal models and their effectiveness and their usefulness. So what do we need? This doesn't mean that all animal models are out, though. We're still not at that point. But what we need in order to use non-human animals more effectively, efficiently, and in ways that make good scientific sense, not just ethical sense, but good scientific sense, is these three things. We need to fully understand the animal model. We must fully understand the human disease, and we must have examined the two cases and found them to be substantially congruent in all important respects. Now, Akhtar says that this particular person, David F. Horobin, and contends that those three conditions have not been fulfilled for any human disease. And I agree with that. As far as I can tell, that has not been fulfilled for any human disease. So that means that at each step where you don't have that full understanding, then your comparisons become difficult, if not just fraught, right? So then what we end up studying is the model. We don't end up studying the disease, we understand the model. So take something like brain cancer. We can take brain cancer cells and implant them into an immunosuppressed mouse. But brain cancer is a disease of context. As soon as you change the context, you change the cells, and then the agents you test don't end up applicable to human bodies. Why? Because the model is fundamentally flawed. Right. So here's another case, cancer. Mouse models that use transplants of human cancer have actually had not a terribly great track record of predicting human responses to treatment in clinics. It's been estimated that cancer drugs that enter clinical testing have a 95% rate of failing to make it to the market in comparison to the 89% failure of all therapies. So those numbers alone should give you pause for thought that they're pretty high numbers of failure. And particularly for cancer, they are especially high. And we do trials in people for cancer because animal models do not predict what will happen actually for everything. We end up having to do trials in humans because animal models don't actually predict what will happen in a human body. So despite the use of an estimated 1 billion animals in cancer research over the last decade, cancer continues to increase. And this is a quote that's just actually quite dated, but I would say still holds. We've known this for a long time. Giving cancer to laboratory animals has not and will not help us to understand the disease or to treat those persons suffering from it. A year later, we have, if a species is closely related as mice to rats do not even contract cancer similarly, it's not surprising that 19 out of 20 compounds that are safe for humans cause cancer in animals. And these are old quotes for a reason. This hasn't changed, and we still persist with this. The history of cancer research has been a history of curing cancer in the mouse. We have cured mice of cancer for decades, and it simply didn't work in humans. So we're at this kind of impasse where we say perhaps it is useful in certain circumstances, but what are those circumstances? There are probably far fewer contexts, far fewer types of research than what is generally argued. Vaccines is another one. As I said in the previous lecture, we're now testing vaccines for COVID-19 on a bunch of different animals, including primates in Thailand. I don't know if that research would be allowed here, but yeah, we are doing that. Look, here's a quote about someone talking about the prevention of polio as a historical example. Dr. Albert Sabin, who's the quote here, he was the creator of the oral polio vaccine. So he actually did create the vaccine. So this is a quote from him. It says, prevention of polio was long delayed by the erroneous conception of the nature of the human disease based on misleading experimental models of the disease in monkeys. So he was saying, look, we probably could have got there quicker, but we were using monkeys, and that led us in the wrong direction. As I said, it's also, if you look at the history of vaccines, whilst this is in fact changing and probably has changed from the 1990s onwards, the early history of vaccines, we do have to question their contribution to the elimination of disease compared to hygiene. So anti-spitting campaigns, clean water and food, sewage and rubbish removal, adequate living space, asepsis and antiseptics. So if we look at the history of tuberculosis, the reason that we were able to wipe out tuberculosis was not purely a vaccine thing. It was primarily a result of public sanitation. Why do I say this? I'm not saying this because I want to say vaccines are bad, not at all. In fact, they're very useful and please take them. But I'm saying this because if we hyper-focus our research on animal research and certain kinds of development of treatments, we then don't focus on other things. There's only a certain amount of research money. There's only a certain amount of money for treatments. And if we understand that things like basic sanitation have been pivotal in the history of humankind, then we need to work on ways to eliminate poverty rather than just focus, like, in a kind of narrow sense, on certain kinds of medical treatments. So it's the justification, it's these costs and benefits things, right? So if we're trying to weigh these things up, we need to think critically about that. Okay, but does the argument for non-human animal experimentation still stand? So this is just a couple of examples. I haven't given you a big systematic review showing all non-human animal experimentation is out because none of it works. I wasn't arguing that. I was giving you a few examples which may argue that a lot of the time we need to be more critical because research on non-human animals hasn't, and it doesn't work. So this isn't an all or nothing position. Given the large number of animal studies conducted and the historical success of some of them at least, we could still argue for their use, especially in the context of biomedicine, with more stringent restrictions, right? I have to place that as a caveat. There needs to be more stringent restrictions on what's possible to do and to which animals. Is that all there is to it though? Well, no, because at the end of the day, we have choices about what kind of experimentation we do and what kind of methodology we employ and what kinds of technologies we develop for that methodology, right? So here's your question. Based on these successful examples, so if you think of in the history of biomedicine, there are successful examples of where non-human animals have been used in the creation of medicines and treatments that are pivotal in the lives of many humans. Okay, based on those successful examples, one may argue that despite the many limitations, animal experiments have provided useful information. While this assertion would certainly not be inaccurate, the question remains, is animal experimentation the best way to get the information we need today? So we take the question away from have they been useful to, but is it the best way to act now? Which is a very different question. So in the past, the use of non-human animals may have been the best that we could do to understand basic human and non-human physiology and anatomy. But now that we've got this understanding of ethics and we understand more about non-human animals, their capacities, their sentience, their consciousness, their rationality, their sociality, etc., and we understand the limitations of animal models used in research and teaching, here's my argument. We need to invest in exploration of alternative techniques with more vigor, right? And we need appropriate regulatory change that reflects changing technology. So at the moment, non-human animal models are necessary elements in the development of pharmaceuticals. If we are able to develop technology to avoid that, then there needs to be regulatory change to allow for those non-human animals to be removed from the process. Now, I've included here current university policies in Australia. You can find Sydney Uni on there. You can see that we do allow all sorts of non-human animal research. And I think we need to think critically about when that's necessary versus when it's not necessary. And we need to be a lot more stringent about the way that we allow or disallow these kinds of practices. So here's an argument for this. If you are interested in reading it from The Conversation, which is a wonderful website, and you should all read articles from The Conversation. For those of you who don't know The Conversation, it only takes only takes articles written by academics, and they have to disclose any funding that they get from anyone. So you can be assured that the quality of information is good, although it's not necessarily without controversy, because academics have opinions on things, right? So this piece is about research providing a flawed model. It's about exactly what I was talking about, that animal models are not a great model for human bodies. So why not stop? And she argues quite effectively, I think, that we need to phase it out, and we need to place more effort on alternatives. This is just an example of an alternative. We can grow human cells in laboratories. We can grow human organs in laboratories. We can do digital models of the human system, and we can actually use humans more in research in ways that are smarter and less likely to cause harm, and will provide us with better information for the development of medical treatments and so on. So here are my conclusions. The first is a general one, and it's to remind you that at the end of the day, science has ethical limits, and these apply to the nature of research and what the process of research does to others. Now, you may not have agreed with me on this one, but I think this is a very important argument, the second one, which is species membership has no moral significance. That line between humans and non-human animals, the only reason we put that down is because of speciesism, which is exactly the same as racism or or homophobia or sexism, discrimination of any form. It's arbitrary. The reason we think that racism is bad is because the line is arbitrary, right? We have just said there's a difference between me and a person of color. Why? There's no difference. I mean, there are physical differences, but they're not morally relevant differences. And that line between humans and non-human animals is, again, it's one that we need to disintegrate, because there are reasons that we should confer non-human animals with moral consideration. Now, the next argument, if you're an animal rights person, you won't agree with this, but if you're a utilitarian or even a Kantian, you could argue that there may be a small number of cases where animal experimentation is ethically permissible. And what I would suggest is that when you use non-human animals in research in veterinary science, now not all research in veterinary science is going to be ethically permissible in this view, but perhaps because the benefit of the research is conferred upon non-human animals, then the use of non-human animals in that research, it becomes even grayer, right? There might be cases there where it's permissible, or very singular things. But largely, it's not. And there are problems with using non-human animals that have nothing to do with ethics. It's about science. Animal testing can be ineffective and unreliable. And so if we're making these kinds of cost-benefit decisions about what to use in research or what methodology to use, then we need to be critical towards the use of non-human animals in experiments in the same way that we would be critical of any kind of methodology, right? Because that's evidence-based research. And then the final conclusion is that as a result of this, we need to invest in the further development of scientific techniques and procedures that do not require the use of non-human animals, and encode that in regulation and law. That's the only way we're going to see change on that. And my argument is that the reason that you would be swayed in this direction is twofold. It's the combination of an ethical argument for the moral status of non-human animals, combined with this scientific argument for the improvement of scientific research, especially in medicine. So when you combine those two together, you get a very strong case that at the very lowest bar, like the very least we can do, is develop alternatives that don't require non-human animals, that we can cut them out, and that then that needs to be encoded in regulation and law, so it's actually possible to avoid the use of non-human animals in research. So that's all from me. If you would like the references, please do email me. And as I said, usually I make these lectures quite interactive, and I encourage people to ask me questions and to have a discussion. But because this is pre-recorded, I just want to say you can always email me and we can chat. I can also organize Zoom sessions. So thank you very much for having me, and I hope you enjoyed what I presented to you today. And yes, have a lovely week.